I'm Eleanor Hartley, 74 years old, and last night I stood in the hallway of my son's home, listening to his wife call me the old woman. She wanted out of the way. She didn't know I was awake or that I could hear every word through the kitchen door. She said, my house was worth a fortune, and they had already signed the papers behind my back. They planned to put me in a nursing home. Say I was confused and sell everything. Frank and I had built together. By the time I returned to my bedroom, I had a bag half packed and a plan forming quietly in my head before I go any further. Let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like button. If you've ever had to outsmart someone who thought they had you cornered. I grew up in coastal Maryland, the kind of place where everyone knew whose tomato plants grew best and who baked the softest rolls for Sunday service. My parents ran a little repair shop, mostly outboard motors and lawnmowers, and they taught me early that showing up on time and doing work right the first time mattered more than being flashy. We didn't have much, but we had routines and porch swings and the same hand-me-down quilt that went on every bed in the house. I met Frank at a county fair when I was 17. He was quiet, gentle, good with his hands, and thoughtful in ways that didn't call for attention. We married a year later, bought a modest house in a neighborhood called Seaside Hollow, and lived there nearly 50 years. I worked as a financial coordinator for a construction firm. Frank fixed things, helped our neighbors, kept the garden blooming, until the arthritis got too bad. He passed last October in the living room, with the windows open and my hand in his. After he was gone, the house felt too still, the kind of quiet that made it hard to think. Gar, our only son, said I couldn't live alone at my age, not with stairs and an old boiler and no one to check on me. He and his wife Paige had a spare room and 2 teenagers, and they lived in Henlow Acres, a newer part of town, full of crisp sidewalks and lawn service trucks. Gar meant well, I think, but Paige always smiled like she was trying not to show her teeth. My room was small but clean, the bed too soft, the curtains too bright. She called it my cozy corner and put a plastic pitcher of lemon water on the nightstand, said it was good for circulation. Every time she walked past my door, she'd say, "How are we feeling today?" Like I was someone's patient, not someone who had balanced accounts with 7-figure budgets and still kept my mind sharp with puzzles and market reports for months. I said nothing. I smiled when they asked how I slept. I gave birthday cards with crisp $20 bills inside. I let her pick out my clothes for family dinners. Colors, she said, photographed better in group shots. But last night changed everything. It was after 2, I couldn't sleep. The fan was spinning warm air, and I was thinking of Frank of the rose bushes by the back fence when I heard voices down the hall. Low, urgent. Paige saying we had to move fast. She told Gar the buyer was ready and the house had to be sold before the development plans were announced. She said, "We just need her out of the picture," and when Gar asked what if I didn't agree, she reminded him, I'd already signed over power of attorney last winter, when I had pneumonia. I remembered that visit. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and dry carpet. Paige had handed me a clipboard, said it was for supplemental coverage. I signed without reading, and she'd smiled, patted my knee. By the time I crept back to my room, I knew what I had to do. My life, my home wasn't theirs to take quietly. Not now, not ever tomorrow, when the house is empty. I'll pack my documents, my bank cards, and the picture of Frank that never leaves my nightstand. I'll leave something behind to make them think the worst and buy me time, not because I want to scare them, but because they need to understand what it means to underestimate a woman who spent her life doing the math. I'll start with a call to Winifred, an old friend who still lives 30 miles away in a town no one thinks to check. She used to be a nurse. She knows how to keep a secret, and once I'm gone, I'll start putting the rest of the pieces in motion. By the time I reached Winifred's porch, the sun was just rising over the bay, brushing the sky in pale orange and quiet blue. She opened the door before I could knock, wrapped me in a hug, and said I made tea. "Come in." I stepped into her living room, still holding the weight of what I'd overheard the night before. My hands were steady, but the inside of me hadn't stopped shaking. We sat in her front room, surrounded by books and quilts and the faint smell of lavender. I told her everything. I didn't soften it, and I didn't rush. I just laid it out. Paige's plan, the forged power of attorney, the conversation I heard through the kitchen door. Winifred didn't blink. She just listened and poured more tea when mine got low. "I have someone you need to meet," she said when I was finished. "My nephew's in town for a few days. Daryl. He's a private investigator. You helped his mama with that tax mess years back he still remembers." That evening, Daryl came by just as the day was cooling down. He was stocky mid-40s with careful eyes and a notebook he carried like a habit. I told him my story from the beginning. He asked a few questions but didn't interrupt. When I was done, he nodded slowly. "Overheard conversations not enough," he said. "We'll need more recordings, paperwork, a good look at the notary who signed that power of attorney. But this isn't the first time someone's tried something like this. You'd be surprised how common it is." I wasn't. That night, I stayed up in the guest room, going through my folder of documents, birth certificate, marriage license, insurance papers, account ledgers. Everything I might need to prove who I was, where I stood, and what was mine. The next morning, Daryl left for Henlow Acres with a small recorder and the patience of someone who's used to waiting in coffee shops. Meanwhile, I called Morton, my old colleague and financial advisor. His voice caught when he heard mine, and I heard the click of his office door closing. "I need to know everything," I told him. "Every account, every investment, every dollar. And I need you to look into Gar and Paige's finances too." Quietly. There was a long pause on the line. Then Morton said, "Give me a day." That afternoon, I met with the lawyer Winifred had arranged, Leonard Finch. He was in his 80s, white-bearded, sharp-eyed, and slow-spoken in a way that made you listen. After reviewing what little I had, he leaned back in his chair and said, "If you didn't knowingly grant power of attorney, and you can prove the signature was forged, we can challenge it, especially if there's reason to believe you were being manipulated. But we'll need a handwriting expert, and we'll need to act quickly." That evening, Daryl returned. He sat down across from me, and Winifred pulled a recorder from his coat pocket and hit play. It was Paige's voice, clear and crisp, talking to a man named Bruckheimer, the same one she'd mentioned that night in the kitchen. She was calm, confident, even casual. "I can produce all the necessary documents," she said. "The power of attorney is legal, and honestly, even if she comes back, she won't be in any state to contest it. She's not well." I looked down at my hands resting in my lap. They weren't shaking anymore. The next morning, Morton called. "Eleanor," he said, "you've got about $380,000 in diversified investments. Retirement accounts are solid, and your assets are growing. You're in good shape." I exhaled. "And Gar and Paige?" "Not so good," he said. "They've got 2 mortgages, maxed out credit cards, and Paige has been funneling money into something called Aram Invest. It's either a pyramid scheme or close to one. Nearly 80,000 gone in 12 months. That explained the urgency. They weren't just being greedy. They were drowning. Later that night, Daryl came back with more recordings, this time of Paige confirming she wanted the deal done before the tech announcement went public. She was using my disappearance as leverage. "They've gone to the police," he added. "Said you left a note. Implied it might be a suicide." I looked at him. "Will that make things harder?" "Not necessarily. Could even work in your favor. It brings everything out into the open. But it means they'll start looking for you." The next day, Tula called. She spoke softly, her voice low like she was hiding in a closet. "Grandma," she said, "the police were at the house. They're asking questions. They traced your last phone calls, and they know they weren't made near the beach like Daddy said. They're expanding the search toward Lewis." I thanked her, Told her she was smart. Told her I loved her. And after I hung up, I told Daryl and Winifred what she said. It's only a matter of time now, I said. I won't be able to stay hidden much longer. Then we don't wait, Daryl said. I've got a friend at Amber Technologies. I'll reach out. We'll see if they'll meet. That afternoon, while Daryl made calls, I sat at Winifred's kitchen table signing papers from Mr. Finch, affidavits, revocation forms, preliminary filings. A formal handwriting review had already been ordered. By early evening, Daryl returned. Meetings set, he said. Tomorrow at 3. Blue Oyster Cafe, just outside of town. Deputy Director of Development will be there. Name's Elliot Price. You'll want to speak clearly and stay calm. I nodded. I've got plenty to say. As the sun dropped below the horizon, Winifred brought me a quilt for the porch swing. I sat outside for a while, the night air brushing my face, the hush of the garden settling around me. Somewhere inside, a kettle whistled, and through the kitchen window, I saw Daryl going over his notes preparing for tomorrow. There wasn't much else to do now, but wait. Tomorrow, I'd meet the man behind the company Paige had tried to deceive. I'd tell him who really owned that land and what it would cost to take it from me. The next day was clear and breezy, the kind of fall morning where the air feels lighter than usual. Daryl picked me up just after lunch, wearing a dark jacket and carrying the same weathered notebook I'd seen him use a dozen times already. We didn't talk much on the way. The road to the Blue Oyster Cafe followed the bay for a few miles, then turned inland past a row of quiet shops and a marina that had seen better days. When we pulled into the gravel lot, I noticed the car already parked by the far wall, sleek black, and far too polished for this part of town. Elliot Price was already at the back table when we walked in, a man in his 40s with neatly combed hair and the kind of posture that told you he wasn't used to waiting long. He stood when we approached and shook my hand with both of his. Mrs. Hartley, he said, thank you for meeting with me. Thank you for agreeing to it, I replied. We sat, and Daryl ordered coffee for the table without needing to ask what I wanted. Price opened a thin folder in front of him. I understand you have concerns about a property on Primrose Street. Our team has been in contact with a representative who claimed to have legal authority over the estate. That representative, I said, is my daughter-in-law, and she has no such authority. He nodded. Mr. Hall explained some of the circumstances. I took out a copy of the notarized document Paige had used. I laid it flat on the table between us. This signature isn't mine. I never signed it knowingly. I was recovering from pneumonia when she had me sign what I thought were insurance forms. Price looked down, took a long breath, and nodded slowly. Have you filed anything to revoke it? My attorney has already submitted the petition, I said. There's also a handwriting expert's report confirming the forgery. Daryl reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small recorder. We also have audio from a conversation between Mrs. Paige Hartley and the buyer she brought forward. She mentions wanting to rush the deal before your company's announcement goes public. She refers to Mrs. Hartley's disappearance as convenient timing. We let him hear it. The recording wasn't long, but it was enough. Price sat back in his chair afterward and tapped the table with one knuckle. I'll be honest, he said. This is a mess. We've been working with Mr. Bruckheimer for weeks. He approached us with what appeared to be clean offers on 3 parcels in the development zone. We had no reason to question his authority. I folded my hands on the table. You do now. He nodded once. Yes, ma'am, we do. There was a silence that followed, not awkward, just thoughtful. Then he spoke again. I have to ask, are you still open to selling? I looked him in the eye. That depends. On 3 things, I said. First, I want a fair offer, one that reflects the actual value of the land, especially with your expansion plans. Second, I want to retain a portion of the backyard, the garden. My husband's ashes were scattered there. I won't have it disturbed. And third, any deal goes directly through me with proper documentation and nothing signed until that forged power of attorney is legally dissolved. He nodded as he jotted something in a notebook. Those are fair conditions. I'll need to clear them with the senior development team, but I believe we can work with that. Our current offer was set at $2 million, but given the strategic placement of your lot, I think we can increase it. I'll speak to the team. He folded the papers, stood, and offered his hand again. Thank you for bringing this to us directly. I'll be in touch. The drive back was quiet. Daryl didn't say anything until we were halfway home. He seemed honest. He did. And that offer's going to climb, he said, watching the road. That lot's more valuable than they let on, especially since you're the last holdout on that block. That evening, I stood out on Winifred's porch, hands around a cup of tea, watching the sun ease its way behind the trees. The porch swing creaked in the wind. Inside, I could hear the faint hum of the dishwasher, and Daryl on the phone with Beatrice updating her on the meeting. Around 8, the house phone rang. It was Tula. Grandma? She whispered. Mom's been pacing the kitchen for the past hour. She's on the phone constantly. Dad's barely saying anything. The police were here again today. They brought something with them. Papers, I think. Something about your cell phone signal. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. What did she say? She told them you didn't know anyone in Lewis, but they're going to keep searching. Thank you, honey, I said. Just keep your ears open and stay quiet. I will, she said. Everything okay? Winifred asked as I set the phone back on its cradle. They're getting closer, I said. The police know I've been making calls from this area. We figured that would happen, Daryl said from the next room. Beatrice called just after 9. She'd filed the paperwork. The court date would be set within the week, and the expert's report on the signature had come through definitive. It wasn't mine. The next step was up to Amber Technologies. I think they're going to come through, I said as I set the phone down. They've got more to lose than I do. That night, I slept for nearly 7 hours straight, and in the morning, for the first time in a long while, I woke up with a full breath in my lungs and a quiet room that smelled faintly of sunflowers and cinnamon. 2 days later, a letter arrived by courier. It was from Elliot Price, typed on firm paper with the Amber Technologies crest at the top. I opened it at the kitchen table while Winifred was out feeding her hens. The offer had been raised to $2.8 million. It was signed directly by their general counsel and marked contingent upon clear legal ownership. A handwritten note at the bottom read, "We will wait for your direction." I folded the paper carefully and tucked it back in the envelope. The house I had shared with Frank all those years, the garden where he'd planted peonies and spread mulch by hand every spring, was now the final link in a corporate expansion plan. And I was the only one standing in the way. That afternoon, I sat on the back porch swing and watched the trees shift in the breeze. Daryl joined me not long after, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. He passed one to me and sat without saying anything. You read it? He asked after a while. I did. You're thinking about the house. I nodded slowly. It's not just the house. It's the neighborhood. The little stone path he built. The marks on the doorframe from when Gar was growing. Daryl leaned forward, elbows on his knees. You wouldn't be selling it to them. Not really. You'd be choosing how to end it on your terms. That matters. Later that evening, Tula called. Her voice sounded thin and tired. Grandma, Mom's losing it, she said. She thinks someone from the company leaked something. She's been shredding papers for an hour. Dad won't talk to her. He just went down to the basement and hasn't come up since lunch. I listened quietly as she went on. Police had returned once, asking more questions. Paige had told them again that I'd been unwell, that I'd become confused. They're building something, Grandma, some kind of story, but it doesn't feel solid. Just keep watching. Write everything down if you can, I said. And don't let anyone see you doing it. The next morning, I went with Daryl to the courthouse. Leonard Finch had arranged for us to review the signature findings with the judge assigned to the case. The hearing had been pushed forward. We were on the docket for Thursday. 3 days. We'll bring the handwriting analyst in by teleconference, Leonard said as we left. She's firm. There's no doubt it's a forgery. On the way home, we stopped at a small diner just off Route 40. The waitress brought coffee in thick white mugs and a slice of rhubarb pie on a chipped plate. I didn't eat much. I was thinking about what I'd say in court, how I'd explain what had been done, and what it meant without sounding angry or lost. That night, I opened Frank's old toolbox. The latch still stuck on the left side. Inside were small screwdrivers, extra keys, and a faded red envelope with our property deed tucked inside. His handwriting was on the back, just a note, "Home is ours, until we say otherwise." I kept the envelope on my nightstand. The next day was slow. Winifred baked cornbread and dusted the living room. I stayed out of the way. Around mid-morning, a police cruiser rolled slowly down her street. It didn't stop, but I saw the officer glance toward the porch. "They're circling closer," Daryl said as he walked back inside. That afternoon, Elliot Price called. "We're moving forward on the Primrose Corridor," he said. "But I wanted you to know the company received a cease and desist notice filed by your daughter-in-law. She's claiming sole legal authority under the existing power of attorney." "She has no authority," I said. "That will be made clear on Thursday." "I believe you," he replied. "We're not responding to her directly. Not until the court makes a ruling." The call ended quietly. I stood by the window for a while afterwards, staring out at the edge of the yard, where Winifred's white roses had just begun to bloom. In 3 days, I'd stand in front of a judge. In 3 days, I'd put it all on the record, what had been taken, what I had reclaimed. That evening, I asked Winifred if we could take a drive. Just past dusk, she pulled her old Buick out of the driveway, and we made our way toward Seaside Hollow. We didn't speak much. The streets were quiet. Porch lights were on, and a few windows still glowed with television light. When we reached my house, I asked her to slow down. There it was, still standing. The shutters painted the same soft blue Frank had chosen 20 years ago. The mailbox tilted slightly forward a chip in the wood near the base. In the driveway sat Gar's truck, the same one he'd had since high school. No one was outside. Winifred pulled over down the block behind an overgrown hedge. We sat for a while. "I'm not afraid to lose the house," I said quietly. "I'm just not ready for it to be taken." "I know," she replied. "That's why you're not letting them take it." That night, I fell asleep quickly and didn't dream. The next morning, Daryl met with Leonard to finalize the statement I would read in court. Winifred made sandwiches and packed them in wax paper like it was a Sunday picnic. I stayed upstairs going through a shoebox of papers, old photographs, Frank's ledger, and the first letter Gar had written me from college. Just before dinner, Tula called again. Her voice sounded steadier this time. "They're panicking," she said. "Mom keeps calling the lawyer. Dad says they might lose everything. She mentioned something about making you look unstable, said it wouldn't be hard." "Don't worry," I said. "They've already done the hard part. Now they just have to watch it all come out." Thursday morning came with a gray sky and the smell of damp pavement. Winifred handed me a scarf on the way out the door, the one with the navy blue flowers Frank always said matched my eyes. Daryl was already waiting in the car. He'd reviewed everything with Leonard twice the night before, even highlighting my notes so I wouldn't have to fumble with papers. The courthouse in Lewis sat 2 blocks from the train depot. Red brick with white columns in a parking lot that filled by 8:30. We got there early. Leonard met us by the entrance and walked us through security. I'd never been inside a courtroom before, not like this. We sat in the second row. Paige was already there, dressed in slate gray, with her hair pulled back so tightly it looked painful. Garrett sat beside her, but he didn't speak. He didn't even look in my direction. The judge came in right at 900. She was calm, businesslike. Leonard stood first, presented the expert's findings, and submitted the notarized statement where I confirmed the signature wasn't mine. The audio from Paige's conversation with the buyer was played aloud. Daryl sat beside me, eyes forward steady. When the judge called me to the stand, the courtroom felt colder. I walked up slowly, keeping my steps even. Leonard asked me to state my name and then began. Mrs. Hartley, can you tell the court what you believed you were signing the day your daughter-in-law presented you with these documents? I was told they were medical releases and insurance renewals. I had just come home from the hospital. I wasn't thinking clearly. I trusted her. He nodded. Did you give her permission to sell your house? No, I did not. Were you aware she was negotiating with developers? No. Did she ever ask if you wanted to move? She told me it was already done, that I'd signed everything and there was nothing to be done. He thanked me, then turned toward the judge. No further questions. The other attorney stood, asked a few things I barely remember, mostly about my condition, my memory, whether I'd reviewed the documents afterward. I answered calmly. She didn't push. When I stepped down, I saw Garrett glance at me just briefly. Then he looked away. The judge called a short recess. In the hallway, Leonard pulled me aside. She didn't challenge your statement. Not really. That's a good sign. I don't want them punished, I said. I just want my house back. We're almost there. After recess, Leonard asked for a temporary injunction on all real estate transactions related to my property. The judge approved it immediately. She set a follow-up hearing for the following Tuesday and instructed the court to notify all title offices and brokers. Until then, nothing could move forward. It wasn't the final word, but it was the first step. When we walked outside, the clouds had broken. The pavement still held puddles, but the sun had come through. Daryl offered to drive us out to Bayview for lunch, and I accepted. Winifred met us there carrying a small envelope in her purse, photographs of the garden, just in case the court needed to see what I was protecting. As we waited for our sandwiches, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Tula. Just one line. They're panicking. I didn't write back right away. That afternoon, we sat in the living room while Daryl spoke with Elliot Price. The injunction had reached their office. They were pulling back all current offers on the corridor, pending confirmation of legal ownership. They're being cautious, Daryl said when he hung up. They want this deal, but not at the cost of a lawsuit. I nodded. Let them wait. That evening, I walked out into the garden behind Winifred's house. The sunflowers were still leaning from the morning rain. I knelt down and pulled a few weeds, brushing soil from my palms as I stood. Frank used to say it wasn't the size of the plot that made it home. It was what you planted in it, what you kept safe. Later that night, I wrote out the statement I would give at the next hearing. Just a few paragraphs. Plain direct. I folded it and placed it next to the red envelope from Frank's toolbox. I didn't sleep much, but I didn't toss and turn either. The next morning, Tula called again. Grandma, she said you need to know something. I found a check. In Mom's desk. It's from the buyer. Dated before you signed anything. I sat up straighter. Can you take a picture? I already did. I'll send it to your lawyer. She paused. Grandma, I think they were planning this a long time ago. I didn't answer right away. But in my mind, I was already seeing Tuesday's courtroom. The judge's face, the folded statement in my hand, and the look Paige would wear when that picture came up. Tuesday morning came cool and quiet. A low mist hung over Winifred's back garden, softening the outlines of the rose bushes and the old bird feeder that hadn't been filled in weeks. I was already dressed when Daryl knocked on my door. He'd pressed my coat, laid out my documents, and checked in with Leonard before sunrise. Everything was ready. We reached the courthouse at 8:15. Leonard was waiting just inside the lobby, holding a brown envelope that looked too thin for how much it carried. He gave a brief nod, then handed it to me. The photo from Tula, he said. We'll use it during rebuttal. I nodded. I hadn't told Tula we were presenting it. I didn't want her tangled up more than she already was. The courtroom filled slowly. Paige arrived in a pale beige blazer, trying to look neutral. Garrett trailed behind her shoulders, slumped lips tight. I wondered if he knew what she'd done, or if he'd just stopped asking. When the judge entered, the air settled into silence. Leonard began with a summary of the forgery evidence, then turned to the financial timeline. He walked the court through the wire transfer made to Paige's personal account dated 3 days before I'd supposedly signed anything. Then he showed the check. It was enlarged on the courtroom monitor, the buyer's name clear, the date sharp 1 week before Paige had ever come to my house with those papers. She'd accepted payment in advance, on a deal I never knew existed. There was no sound in the room when he finished. The judge asked Paige to stand. Mrs. Hartley, she said, do you dispute the authenticity of this check? Paige didn't answer. Do you claim the funds were received for another purpose? Still silence. Leonard let it sit a moment longer, then added, we also have sworn testimony from the buyer's assistant confirming this payment was for expedited handling of the sale. Mrs. Paige Hartley presented herself as the sole agent and implied she had durable legal control. The judge turned back to her notes. We will proceed with revoking any claim of legal authority by Mrs. Hartley, she said, and begin formal investigation into real estate fraud and elder exploitation. That word elder settled over the room like a bell. Not sharp, but final. The judge continued confirming that the title would be returned to me pending permanent resolution, and that no further contracts or transactions would be honored. She ordered a temporary protection notice to prevent any future transfer requests. It was over, or nearly. When court adjourned, I stood slowly smoothing the folds of my coat. Paige stayed seated for a long while, staring down at the table. Garrett didn't move. Outside, Darrell exhaled long and low. You did it, he said. It's yours again. Winifred had driven in for the verdict. She met us on the steps with a thermos of coffee and a package of oatmeal cookies wrapped in wax paper. She didn't say anything, just handed them over with both hands as if that settled something. We drove back to our house in near silence. At a red light, I asked Darrell to pull into the gas station on 7th and Bay. I want to walk the rest of the way, I said. He looked at me. You sure? I nodded. It was a 4-block walk. The breeze had picked up. I kept one hand on my purse and the other tucked under my coat. With each step, I felt the weight of the papers against my ribs. Title deed, court orders, the photograph of the check folded between them. As we reached the block where Winifred lived, a truck pulled up slowly beside me. Garrett. He rolled the window down halfway. I didn't know, he said. I didn't respond. I thought she was helping. She said you were confused, that you wanted to sell. I kept walking. I should have asked you. I should have come by. He stopped talking. The window stayed open for a few more seconds, then slid shut again. When I reached Winifred's steps, I heard the truck drive off. That evening, Elliot Price called again. We'd still be honored to work with you, Mrs. Hartley, he said. But only on your terms, and only when you're ready. I thanked him, then asked him to hold off until I reached out. I wanted a few days to sit in my own quiet before thinking about anything more. After dinner, I took the red envelope out again, placed it on the kitchen table, then opened the window and let the night air in. It carried the scent of blooming lilacs and freshly turned soil. I went to bed early, not because I was tired, but because I wasn't. Darrell parked halfway up the drive and let the engine idle. The house looked smaller than I remembered, but the garden was still tidy, the porch rail newly painted. A crisp yellow notice from the county was posted near the front door, a hold on pending transfers effective immediately. I stepped out slowly. The morning light stretched long across the lawn, catching the curve of Frank's old bird bath, and the stone path we'd laid the summer Garrett turned 13. I walked the path carefully, my hand trailing along the wood rail as I climbed the steps. Inside, the air was still. No dishes clinking, no television hum, just the faint scent of lemon oil and dust. It had been cleaned recently, likely by one of the agents prepping it for sale. But the house was mine again. Every room, every drawer, every inch of it. I set my bag down in the front hallway, opened the curtains, and unlocked the kitchen window to let the breeze in. That afternoon, Daryl came by with the binder. He'd printed out every document, court transcripts, title records, sworn statements, and tabbed them for easy reference. At the back was a sealed manila envelope marked OIG Submission Fraud and Abuse. Leonard had helped prepare it. The Office of Inspector General would launch an investigation into Paige's conduct, not just with me, but others. She'd already been flagged in another county for misrepresenting power of attorney with a different elderly seller. I hadn't known that until Leonard dug deeper. Her license is being reviewed, Daryl said, and the local board's been notified. He left the envelope on the table next to the same ceramic fruit bowl Frank had always kept filled with pears. That evening, I made a pot of tea and sat on the back porch with a small notebook. I began listing things I wanted to restore. The lilac bush needed trimming. The shutters on the side window needed replacing. The pantry needed restocking, not with meal kits and powders, but real things. Dried beans, rolled oats, the good cinnamon. I spent the next few days quietly. I reconnected with the neighborhood association, checked in on Mrs. Elkins down the street, and called the pastor to say I'd be back for services next Sunday. At night, I took long walks through Seaside Hollow, just like I used to. On Thursday, the police followed up. A detective named Marla Dunn came by in plain clothes. She asked questions gently, mostly to confirm the timeline and details of Paige's involvement. I handed her a copy of the forged documents, along with the original sales correspondence Leonard had uncovered. "We're seeing a rise in these types of cases," she said, flipping through the folder. "Adult children pushing for quick liquidations. It's often under the radar." She paused. "Most folks don't catch it in time." I nodded. I almost didn't. She asked if I wanted to pursue formal charges. I told her yes. "We'll likely bring financial exploitation to the DA," she said. "It may take a few months, but we'll keep you updated." After she left, I walked through the house room by room. I didn't touch much, just looked. The sewing machine was still covered in its plastic shell. Frank's blue windbreaker still hung behind the back door. Garrett's high school photo still sat crooked on the bookshelf. That night, I reheated some stew I'd frozen before the move and lit a candle on the kitchen table. A quiet meal, the kind I'd once dreaded after Frank passed. But now, it felt steady, like a beginning. Friday morning, I received a letter by certified mail. It was from Garrett. He'd written it by hand. The lines were neat, the ink slightly smudged in a few places. He said he was sorry, that he hadn't seen what was happening, that he'd believed what Paige told him, that I was slipping, that I needed help, that it was better for everyone if they stepped in. He ended the letter with, "If you ever want to see the kids again, I'd understand if you didn't, but they miss you." I set the letter down and stared at it for a long time. I wasn't ready to reply. Not yet. Instead, I folded it neatly, tucked it between two books in the hallway shelf, and took a walk around the block. It was almost dusk, and the neighborhood was full of porch lights flicking on and sprinklers ticking in slow arcs over the lawns. By the time I reached the front steps again, the sky had turned that deep indigo blue, the color Frank always said meant clear weather the next day. On Sunday morning, I put on my softest cardigan and walked to the corner church. The pews were full, but familiar. Mrs. Elkins gave me a little wave from 2 rows ahead, and Pastor Jenkins nodded when he saw me slip in. His sermon was about patience and harvest, how some roots take longer to yield but still come through in their time. I listened with my hands folded the wooden bench warm beneath me and thought about everything that had happened since I left this house and everything that had happened since I came back. That afternoon, I finally replied to Garrett's letter. Just a few lines. I told him I'd received it, that I appreciated the honesty, that I needed time, but I hadn't closed the door. I included a photo, one taken just last week, of the front porch with the hydrangeas in bloom, the same ones he used to help water when he was little. A few days later, I heard from my attorney. Paige had been served. The court was moving forward, and her license had been suspended during the investigation. There would likely be fines, maybe even jail time. But for me, the weight had already begun to lift. Not because of what she lost, but because of what I got back: my home, my voice, and the right to say no more without having to shout it. I reopened my quilting circle in the community center 2 blocks away. There were only 4 of us that first Thursday, just enough to fill a table, but the coffee was hot and the conversation easy. I brought a pattern I hadn't touched in years. Frank used to call it the quiet star because of how it looked from across the room. I think I'll finish it this winter. Some evenings, I sit on the porch with a book I'm not really reading, just listening to the breeze rustle through the trees. The mail carrier waves. Sometimes a neighbor stops by with fresh zucchini or extra plums. And every so often, I catch the sound of a child's laughter drifting through the air, usually from the new family 2 doors down. It reminds me that time keeps moving, but not everything has to be left behind. One night, I opened the drawer in the hallway and pulled out the letter again. I held it under the lamplight, reading each word slower this time. And for the first time, I didn't feel the ache in my chest. Just space. A little more room than there was before. I don't know what Garrett and I will be one day, but I know what I am now: not forgotten, not helpless, and not small. I'm Eleanor May Fletcher, 79 years old, and I still have a garden to tend, a house to protect, and a life that belongs to me. If you're still listening, thank you for walking through this with me. If you've ever had to stand your ground when the people closest to you stopped listening, I hope you know it's never too late to start again. And if this story stayed with you, maybe share it with someone who needs to hear it. Or just leave a note below. I'll be here on the porch, watching the sun slip down behind the lilacs, steady, quiet, and still standing.